I love the little got it note there. Okay. Okay, welcome back to everyone after Thanksgiving, the big disruption in the fall quarter. We're glad to be back. We have 2 more sessions this week and next. I want to begin, as I always do, with the UW Tribal Land Acknowledgement, saying that the University of Washington acknowledges the Coast Salish peoples of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. And as I've been thinking about that land acknowledgement, and we've been having people talk about that all quarter, I've been kind of developing my own commentary on that, which I will, having tried out last night, share again today, because we need to pause and think about important words like that, right? These words acknowledge, I think, the importance of tribal sovereignty, and they endorse tribal respect for the lands, the peoples, and the ecosystems of nature and culture in the Puget Sound region. They invoke a commitment to shared knowledge and to open communication grounded in sensitivity to the histories and traditions of those who have preceded us and those who continue to walk with us on shared paths into the future. I'm really excited tonight that we have with us Ashlee Bird. She is a Native American game designer with a PhD in Native American Studies from UC Davis, currently a postdoctoral fellow in American Studies at the University of Notre Dame. She's a member of the Western Abenaki tribe, originally from the Champlain Valley of Vermont. Her dissertation, entitled Representation and Reclamation, the History and Future of Natives in Gaming, theorizes tribal sovereignty, drawing on Native American studies, media studies, and game studies to address representations of Native American characters in video games. She's currently working on a book manuscript tentatively entitled, unless the title has changed since she posted last on the web, Red Dead Redemption, Finding My Place in the Digital West, that explores the complex relationships that different players have with games, and it undertakes an exploration of the Red Dead Redemption series and what those games have offered or not offered to their player bases. She has a life beyond academia as well, which I always find impressive, having created artworks, publicly exhibited in group and solo exhibitions, curated a show, and designed 2 original video games of her own, One Small Step and Full of Birds. I'm not a video gamer myself, but I encourage you to look for those and play them afterwards and report back to me. She has moreover studied Abenaki, which I always find really impressive, right? Recovering and passing on languages of all kinds, I think, is crucially important. She is also working with the, and I'm going to get the pronunciation wrong, not on purpose, but so she can correct me here, the Wôbanakik Heritage Center to help develop a digital museum featuring elements of Abenaki history and culture. So correct my pronunciation first, and then I turn the time over to you, Ashlee, for the next hour or so.
Well, you're really close. It's Wôbanakik. So that O with the accent, yeah. Kwai kwai nidombak paak winong wizian ndelawazi Ashlee Hope Bird nia pahana Wôbanaki nia odzihilau bataubagok. Hello, my friends. It's so great to see you. My name is Ashlee Hope Bird. I'm an Abenaki woman. I'm originally from Bataubagok, the middle place, or the Champlain Valley of Vermont. I'm really excited to talk to you tonight. Thank you all so much for coming and for having me. I'll go ahead and start this thing here. Come on. Slideshow. So tonight I'm going to talk to you about this. The title of this talk is Organic Mechanics, Video Game Constructions of the Earth and Indigenous Resistance. So a bit about myself. I have a BA in American Studies and English and American Literature from Middlebury College. My master's is in American Studies with an emphasis in literature from the University of Nottingham. I recently received my PhD in Native American Studies from UC Davis. I'm currently a postdoc at Notre Dame. And I'm interested in decolonial design, play as oral tradition, Indigenous literature, film and media, and games as tools for cultural preservation and education. And when I'm not at work, I hang out with this guy, my dog Hagrid, who chooses to sit like a human man for some unknowable reason. So a little bit of a roadmap for this talk. It's kind of going to be the two things I like the most, game studies and Native American studies. And I first want to start out with kind of a game studies dive into, especially because this is an environmental series, constructions of the earth and land in video game spaces and the ways in which players are taught to play and relate to the physical environment in these spaces. Then also, how representation of Native American peoples in video games kind of lacks regional specificity, lacks any kind of connection to the land because of these modes of play. Then go over kind of understandings of the land in Native American cultures and epistemologies, and then speak to some successful representation of regional specificity and their significance by Indigenous creators. So to start with, I want to talk about the idea of power and biopower in particular. So Dyer, Witheford, and Deputer talk about the concept of biopower, that not only do they invoke Foucault's concept of biopower, the explosion of numerous and diverse techniques for achieving the subjugation of bodies and the control of populations. And they specifically talk about this in the MMO, the massively multiplayer online game. But not only do the developers of games control the physical bodies of players that engage with them, they also control their in-game avatars, which can be kind of problematic when you think about marginalized figures represented in games. And they also specifically and carefully curate and control the earth and the physical geography of games, primarily in how it should exist in relation to the player. In many popular video games, the earth exists as a tool, a canvas for real creation, as well as a form of capital. And the locus of control and notion of biopower within digital spaces should be applied, especially when you think about native epistemologies, to the physical spaces of the earth itself in games. And Minecraft is a really good example of this to dive into. Sean C. Duncan talks in his essay, Minecraft Beyond Construction and Survival, about the tool of open space in this game can be broken down and compartmentalized into capital. The earth in Minecraft is able to be broken into pieces that either form the capital of durable goods that can be utilized to produce goods or services, even if the services are for yourself, or in the form of goods that can be exchanged for other goods, services, or currency. And so it creates this second form of biopower, wherein both the game developer and the player are in control of the living element of the earth, and its power is harnessed for the purposes of player desire and progress. So there's something that I like to call the Minecraft effect that happens in Minecraft in particular, and in a lot of these games wherein the earth is a consumable object. So this plays off of kind of the coexistence of Noah Wardrip-Fruin in expressive processing talks about the Tailspin effect and the Simcity effect. And these are processing effects in games. And so the Tailspin effect is signified when a piece of software appears to the user as something very simple on the surface, but is belying the complex workings happening deeper that are only occasionally evident through interaction. So looks really simple up top, is really complicated structurally underneath. The SimCity effect is a system where interaction and observation create system understanding. So essentially, you learn through playing the game. You learn through interacting with the system. The Minecraft effect has both of these happening at once. So Minecraft visually is very blocky and pixelated. It's aesthetically and strategically approachable, and it fosters a player sense of comfort. This comfort quickly takes root in the game, and that is much more complicated than it appears. And therefore, the player is able to quickly take advantage of the broad spaces and possibilities within the game. Thus, when players explore with abandon, their sense of limitless possibility is nourished by the robust underworkings of the game. Contrarily, players are much more reluctant to explore wildly in a physical environment that is much more strategically and visually intimidating, kind of leading to the little bit of a failure, a little bit of a flop that was Hello Games' No Man's Sky, which, although visually breathtaking, is filled with foreign landscapes, large aggressive beasts, vast expanses of unforgiving, unyielding, and fairly barren landscape, all of which the player is thoroughly unequipped to deal with at the beginning of the game, both in terms of experience and mechanical ability. Additionally, the Minecraft effect enables a sense of player mastery through its ability to teach a player via interaction the skills required to excel, as well as providing an understanding of the more basic mechanics of the system without any kind of direct instruction. So this lack of direct instruction and the emphasis on instruction through interface provides a player with the sense that they're excelling at the game through their outright skill. As their learning becomes play and as this play develops into the positive feedback loop of achievement as their learning grows and subsequently their play becomes more advanced. This dynamic of a positive feedback loop wherein the player is becoming ever more ambitious and capable in the world which they are working remains unchanged and easily accessible and malleable. It's amplified even further by the simplicity of the game mechanics. So players are really quickly able to feel like they are just so good at this game, like they have all the skills they need to succeed, and it just creates this feedback loop. Instead, it kind of further perpetuates the illusion of the game being simple on all fronts, whereas the simple mechanics of, punch tree, get wood, build bench, do not truly relay the detailed procedural generation happening under the surface of this game. These minimalistic mechanics produce a learning curve in terms of control that's short and gentle, and therefore mastery, even without direct instruction, is achieved swiftly. In a game like No Man's Sky, however, players are much less adept at the beginning of the game, and their endeavors to explore or make any kind of impact are often met with very little reward. Furthermore, the game teaches through texts and button prompts, clearly indicating to the player that they're a novice, that their hand is being held, that they're being taught. Therefore, the combination of the Tailspin effect and the Simcity effect create this Minecraft effect, a player who has both a sense of comfort and game mastery in regards to simulated geography, within the simulated geography with which they're playing. And the importance of the power dynamic that the Minecraft effect enables is in its connection to a player's perceived relationship with the earth that they encounter within the game. A relationship contingent on leveraging of man over machine or man over earth. And so Bernard Stiegler talks about this concept of epiphylogenesis, which is that there's the co-evolution of man and tool. And in the development of this concept, he uses the example of flint to explain it, that not only is man formed to and defined by the tool, wherein man becomes a predator through the utilization of flint and the spear, but the tool is also formed to and defined by man. Flint is evolved to fit into the form of the human hand. And this analysis of epiphylogenesis is really relevant to the discussion of Earth-based video games. In these games, just as in reality, the physical geography of the world has co-evolved with man, influencing everything from the clothes he wears to the languages he speaks, or Stiegler would argue this, and subsequently man has co-evolved to form the land to himself. This concept is on display in Minecraft. Man uses wood, stone, diamond, and many other natural elements to harvest the means by which he may live and construct his world. However, there's a distinct hierarchy in this relationship between man and the machine of the earth that takes place in this game that's not present within the original concept of epiphylogenesis. In Minecraft, man has evolved past the earth. Man has found a way to punch a tree and shave off neatly formed blocks of wood that have a specific value that can be easily mashed together with other harvested materials to form tools and objects. Man has in this relationship complete dominance as well as complete influence and control. The earth, the tool, no longer has any form of control or influence and is simply broken down into its parts to create even more tools. The ideal form of epiphylogenesis would be some kind of symbiotic relationship where both parties are mutually benefited, they give back to each other. One does not exist in a position of power over the other. Both are kind of codependent, but Minecraft doesn't create this codependency. The mutual benefits go out the window completely. The player gives nothing back to the earth and only takes. The earth cannot resist the player. The mere mortal, with your like blocky pixelated hand literally beats the earth into submission and breaks it into parts that become anything you want. You are all powerful in this relationship. And it's this kind of supraphylogenesis, this establishment of a power dynamic, a surpassing of this epiphylogenetic relationship wherein coevolution has reached its peak and one party asserts dominance over the other. And the term supraphylogenesis indicates the establishment of this power dynamic. And in Minecraft and many God games specifically, the player is the dominant figure. In the larger spectrum of God games like The Sims, Black and White, Zoo Tycoon, the player is the supraphylogenetic figure over other life forms. You control their fate with the click of a mouse, the stroke of a key. But in Minecraft, that power is almost completely and solely exerted over the earth, the living being of the earth, to use however the player deems useful. And games that do not create this binary, this supraphylogenetic relationship where the player is in charge, the player is all powerful, do very financially poorly. Sim Earth is a great example of this. So, you know, these games that don't prioritize and forefront the player, but instead the earth and its autonomy, as well as sometimes kind of the futility of the human within it, and thus the player within the game space, they're poorly received. In Will Wright's 1990 video game Sim Earth, the earth subverts all of the established rules that make Minecraft so enjoyable for players. And it establishes itself as the higher being in the relationship between man and earth. Sim Earth received reviews of 4 out of 10, quote, bad, and 1 out of 5, quote, terrible on IGN and GameFAQs, respectively, when it was revitalized in 2009 for the Wii, which is a stark contrast to the rave reviews that Minecraft has been met with as the most successful independent video game of all time. First and foremost, Sim Earth does not utilize the Minecraft effect. However, the Tailspin effect is in vicious display within Sim Earth. This is a screen cap from it. The visual interface of the game is very similar to something like Dwarf Fortress or Minecraft. It's very pixelated, bright colors, simple symbols, minimalistic, 2D rendering. But the underlying system at work within the game is so deeply complicated that players have a hard time playing. Chris Deleon notes that a game can have complicated rules, but readily teach them through clear feedback loops. But the rules in Sim Earth are not transparent at all. The feedback loops are almost non-existent. Mackenzie Work talks about Sim Earth in the last chapter of his book, Gamer Theory. And he says that, the player is consistently reminded that the rules are outside of their grasp. And he says, quote, it just goes to show how you have to think about all the consequences of anything you do. What if science didn't come up with the answers in time? What if burning fossil fuels didn't kick progress along fast enough? What if people go hungry? What the hell is progress anyway? End quote. So as Work wittily expresses through this analysis, the combination of inputs and outputs in Sim Earth are not only huge, but also unknowable to a certain extent. And the unknowability of Sim Earth is actually really contradictory to the way its maker markets it in the manual, which I find fascinating. I want to read a section from the manual because I think it's really interesting, because if you ever played Sim Earth, you're just like, what? Like, that's not what this is. The manual titles it Software Toys, and this is a quote from the manual. So, Sim Earth isn't exactly a game. It's what we call a software toy. Toys by definition are more flexible and open-ended than games. As an example, compare a game, tennis, with a toy, a ball. In every tennis game, there is one way to begin, one goal to pursue, and one way to end. There are infinite variations in the middle, but they all start the same way, chase the same goal, and end the same way. A ball is more flexible. There are more things you can do with it. With the ball, you can play tennis, you can play catch, you can throw it at someone, you can bounce it, you can make up 100 different games using the ball. Our software toys are programmable. Using the comparison with a ball, this means that you can change the tennis ball into a football, baseball, soccer ball, ping pong ball, etc., and play any and all games you wish to play with those balls. Besides games, there are other things you can do with the ball. You can paint it, you can use it to plug a leaky roof, or just contemplate its roundness. In Sim Earth, the toy is a planet, a programmable planet that it can become an infinite number of planets. So when you play with Sim Earth or any of our software toys, don't limit yourself to trying to, quote, win. Play with it, experiment, try new things, just have fun. But the concept that Sim Earth is a toy is problematic and indeed a factor in the game's incredibly poor reception, and therefore its lack of sequels and longevity. In the manner that Wright describes, toys are transformable to a certain extent. As noted, one can use a tennis ball for a variety of things and is not limited to using it for only playing tennis, which is true. However, what Wright does not account for is that even if the tennis ball is painted or used to play catch with or bounced off a wall or even transformed into a bowling ball, this all exists within the rules of physical reality of the world. Due to the scientific physical realities of our world, even if the player transforms the tennis ball into a bowling ball, they will have a fairly good idea what the outcome will be if they try to kick it. They may not be able to estimate exactly which bones in their foot they're going to break, but they're going to have a general idea of the outcome of their input, kick ball with foot. The outcome is foreseeable based on the nature of the reality within which both they and the bowling ball exist. In Minecraft as well, the game constructs rules that have clear input-output guidelines. Punch tree, get wood. In Sim Earth, there are many different components at work, and the SimCity effect is nowhere to be found, leaving players with little to no understanding of what outcomes their actions will actually conclude in, and no way to find out other than to essentially wait and see, which most often results in the Earth's demise within the game. Therefore, the Earth in Sim Earth is neither a tool, nor a toy, nor capital, as it cannot be used for creation or knowledge, given the lack of rules that would establish being able to use it. It's not a toy, as the lack of input-output correlation does not lead to fun, and it cannot be consumed, used, or traded, but instead uses and consumes the player. Due to the fact that only the simulated Earth knows the rules in Sim Earth, it's the superphylogenetic opposite of Minecraft. As Work pessimistically notes, that the game is playing you. Minecraft positions the player in the supreme locus of dominance. Every bit of the virtual Earth is at their fingertips, but that is the exact opposite case in Sim Earth. Minecraft, with its creepers and zombies and other mystical elements, is not an invocation of the real world. It is in every way supposed to be better. Not only do trees break off perfectly into form chunks, but you, the player, have godlike power with which to make this happen. In Sim Earth, markets itself as better than reality, right in the rules of the game. But when a player is about to begin their endeavor of overseeing a world, the game boasts notes. This scenario can be difficult, but still more fun than the real thing. Unfortunately for players, Sim Earth is so much less enjoyable than the real thing. Due to our nature as humans, we do not have the ability to see the Earth on its epic scale from the beginning of time to its ultimate end with the heat death of the universe. And therefore, our view of the, quote, world is generally confined to the means by which we exist in it. However, Sim Earth allows the player to see the Earth on its grand scale and gives the illusion that the player will have some kind of control over what the outcome at the end of this timeline is. Unfortunately, as Work notes, the best one, quote, the best one can hope for is merely being undefeated, hence the unsatisfying quality of winning in Sim Earth. In the unlikely event that the game rattles on toward the death of the sun, what a win state, this victory amounts to nothing. It fails the fantasy principle, end quote. Sim Earth aptly demonstrates to the player how ultimately pointless humans are in the spectrum of things. Not only is the player not the god that they were in Minecraft, as they have almost no effect on what happens to the Earth, and when they do, it usually makes the Earth die faster, but it is made perfectly clear that the game, and by extension the Earth, as the game is a simulation, does not need mankind and does not need the player in order to function. The game runs by itself. The player can plug in the adjustments they feel are necessary or start a world and simply leave it completely untouched, and the game runs by itself. The Earth runs by itself. And in the spaces of games, not only is the Earth itself not prioritized, But the connection of people to earth, like I said, has usually this power dynamic. It's something to be consumed, even when it comes to Indigenous representations of Indigenous characters and their connection to the land, which is usually completely severed. Instead of a place for meaning making, land and game space become consumable by the player, and Native American characters whose regional attachment might stand in the way of that are subsequently done away with through a complete dispossession of any meaningful ties to place within the digital world. And I want to talk about some examples of that. So one good example of that is Assassin's Creed 3. So this is an Ubisoft game. It came out in 2012. It was recently remastered with Assassin's Creed Odyssey, like 2 years ago, I think. And it's the first ever big budget, like AAA game to feature a Native American protagonist, Connor Kenway. He's half Mohawk, half British. But it forwards a very colonial understanding of the land and the player's relationship to it and Connor's relationship to it. Any of the non-city parts of the game on the map are referred to as the, quote, frontier. This is not how Connor would have viewed the earth as a Mohawk person, as a conquerable space, this kind of manifest destiny narrative. There's also some teepees on the map, like to indicate where Connor lives. He's Mohawk. Mohawk people live in longhouses, not teepees. You would probably freeze to death in a teepee in upstate New York. Also, the voice actor is Blackfoot, not Mohawk, and he had to go out of his way to learn the Mohawk language rather than getting a Mohawk person who understands the language and its like relationship to the culture and the land to voice him. They also have this very capitalistic kind of consumption going on in the game. So there's a hunting mechanic that you can see here. And whenever Connor hunts an animal, he skins it. And whenever he skins it, he says like a little prayer, kind of them being like, look, we did research. We were being culturally sensitive. And if you don't skin 5 animals in a row, you get a message that says Connor used every animal he killed. And if you don't continue to skin animals after that, you desynchronize. You fail out and have to load back in. As long as you skin them, you can kill all the animals you want. I'm pretty sure Connor also didn't make wolves in North America go extinct, And not only that, but hunting and selling pelts is the quickest way to earn money in the game. So it's very much encouraging you to participate in this behavior. The mechanics are belying kind of the narrative. They're undercutting what the game is narratively trying to tell you is going on. Then there's the Red Dead Redemption games and Charles Smith, and he exists in a really interesting space. So in his role in the game, he has all these stereotypical visual markers of Indianness. He wears his hair either in long braids or a scalp lock. He's always wearing some kind of regalia or jewelry. He's the purveyor of knowledge of the natural and the defender of the environment. He teaches the main character how to hunt. He murders some bison poachers after they, kind of telling Arthur about how important the buffalo are to his people, and he murders some poachers. He also serves as the de facto go-between between the Wapiti gang, which is the kind of local group of people, Indigenous people in the game, and the gang that your character is a part of. All of this, and at the same time, he claims to have a complete lack of knowledge in his identity, and there's also complete erasure of his Blackness, which is a completely different conversation. But he says, I don't even know if I have a tribe. I don't know where my mother's people come from, all of this stuff. But all of the things that I've just listed, the way he wears his hair, the kind of jewelry he wears and what it's made of, the clothes he wears, the languages he speaks, the animals that he understands, hunts, and are important to his cosmology are all regionally specific. All of these things are tied to a connection to a specific land base. The Wapiti also have no connection to the land. They live in teepees, and the Wapiti is the Shawnee word for elk, but the language that you hear them speak just a couple times in the game is Lakota. So again, no connection to any specific place or group of people. And even though the main narrative of Red Dead Redemption is kind of telling you that the game is indicating that the frontier is closing and that men like the Vanderlyn gang no longer have a place to prosper, the epilogue ultimately contradicts this, and the mechanics contradict this. The epilogue wipes the Wapiti off the face of the earth. They are gone. And it also completely reopens the frontier. John Marston settles the West, building his cozy homestead with upwards of $20,000 in 1910 in his bank account. And the entire map is now unlocked for you to hunt, roam, consume, do everything freely. There's This Land Is My Land, which is, again, has this incredibly vague pan-Indian narrative, no understanding of location, no understanding of community, this vague idea that you're a chief and you're uniting the tribes, and that experience the frontier from the other side as if there was a uniform experience of colonization for Indigenous peoples in the United States. So when things like this happen, not only do many of the characters in these game spaces have no real world space, they also have no space within the digital realm of the game. When characters like Connor are completely removed from any meaningful connection to their land, an erasure of culture occurs. In games like Red Dead Redemption, the physical removal of Indigenous people from the virtual representation of their land is another form of dispossession and an enactment of digital manifest destiny. And this dispossession is done to mollify the majority of the player populace, who, again, like I said, would view the earth as a consumable object for them, not a living, meaning-making being that is bound to them and them to it. And if you also give Charles a connection to the land and meaning in the areas that you're in, and he's supposed to be the main character's friend, it's going to be a lot harder to like be a bad guy and ruin that land when your friend actually has a connection to it. So these are very purposeful and strategic moves that are done to please the larger player populace in how they view the earth in games and what they think their relationship to it should be. And this is completely diametrically opposed to the way that we as Indigenous peoples understand land and our relationships to it. Indigenous understandings of the land and earth are actually probably much more in line with the symbiotic understandings of it, or even in Wright's construction of the earth as an autonomous being. And for Indigenous people, land is linked to cosmology, language, identity, responsibility, sovereignty, many other things. Vine Deloria, writing in 1969, believed that land was an essential component of Indigenous peoples in the battle for civil rights, that we could not achieve civil rights without land bases. Mishwana Goman asserts that while yes, land is a physical space, it cannot and should not be limited to that. Instead, land is place and it gives place. She says, quote, land is foundational to people's cultural practices. And if we define culture as meaning making rather than as differentiation and isolation in a multicultural neoliberal model, then by thinking through land as meaning making processes rather than a claimed object, the aspirations of Native people are apparent and clear. So it locates a group of people physically, culturally, spiritually, intellectually, et cetera, and provides us with both an internal and external locus of understanding for and within broader society. Land is essential to cosmology. Native cosmologies often shrug Western emphasis on chronology and instead emphasize the importance of place-space narratives. So Deloria, in his book, God is Red, talks about how Abrahamic religions are generally very concerned with time and chronology, and that a lot of religions around the world, Indigenous ones included, have some kind of flood narrative, but Indigenous religions are not concerned about when this happened, but rather where it happened and how it affected the environment and the community around it. Land is also essential to language. Connection to place is foundational to Native American languages. This is Abenaki language and the different words we have for like different kinds of water and different weather. Native peoples our worldviews and our understanding of the world is founded in our languages. And Robin Wall Kimmerer, talking about the Potawatomi language, notes that Indigenous peoples are in an interdependent relationship with their physical environment, and this understanding is encapsulated through language. So she talks about Potawatomi language and that it's a verb-based language, which a lot of Indigenous languages are. So you can't say, for example, that is a bay. but instead the language is verb-based, so it says it is being a bay. And this implies a broader history of this landscape, a storied relationship with the people upon it, a variation of states and times when the bay isn't being a bay. And the community effects of removal are real. Taikai Alfred writes that removal from land is the catalyst for many of the problems facing Indigenous youth today. That it leads to, I won't read the whole thing of this, discordant identities, mass psychopathology, characterized by discordant identities, alienated personalities, and worst of all, a culture of lateral violence fueled by unresolvable self-hatred, because this connection to the land and who we understand ourselves to be as people and our role in the world has been severed. But fortunately, Indigenous game designers are pushing back against this and cultivating and creating better relationships to the land in games and representations of the land in games. This is Never Alone, or Kisima Ingichuna, which was published in 2014 by Eline Media, developed by Upper One Games in cooperation with the Cook Inlet Tribal Council of the Inupiaq Community of Alaska. It's based on the tale Canuck Sayuka, which was first recorded by Robert Nazareth Cleveland. And the tale is about the environment. It's a story about a young person whose community is being ravaged by a blizzard, so they go out to seek the source of the blizzard to stop it and help save their community. The entire game is narrated in the Inupiaq language. It has English subtitles. It uses this interspersing of documentary style clips and gameplay to actually teach you about what you're doing in the game. So it's the first thing you're actually asked to do. It's called Cultural Insights, and you click on them and it's real people from the community talking to you about this game and about the play experiences you're having. They teach you about scrimshaw and what it's made from. They teach you about why owls are save points. They talk about the northern lights and the spirits. They talk about their connection to the environment and the relationship that they have with the land. And it actually teaches you strategies for playing the game. So if you're not paying attention to the wind and the way that the snow is blowing, you're not going to be able to make certain jumps in the game. It's going to push against you and you won't have enough momentum to make it. It teaches you how to use the bola. It teaches you how to trap polar bears on floats of ice, things like this. So it really centers and values the community, the culture, and their relationship to the land. There's another one, Thunderbird Strike, made by Elizabeth LaPensée. It's based on Anishinaabe culture, which punishing human beings for breaking moral rules and defending territories that are sacred and relevant to Anishinaabe culture. It's a 2D side scroller, and you play as Thunderbird flying from the tar sands to the Great Lakes, protecting Turtle Island with lightning from resource extraction. And you can play this in two ways. You can, either choose to destroy things like buildings or vehicles used for resource extraction with your lightning, or you can reanimate animals that have been killed because of resource extraction. And the game doesn't tell you which one you have to do. You can do a combination of both. You can win either way. And hilariously, this game got Elizabeth LaPensée accused of inciting environmental terrorism, which I just think is an award in and of itself. Then there's When Rivers Were Trails. This is a 2D adventure game, kind of playing off of Oregon Trail and where the water tastes like wine. You play as an Anishinaabe person in the 1890s who's displaced from their traditional territory in Minnesota and heads west to California due to the impact of allotment on Indigenous communities. You face Indian agents, you meet people from different nations, you hunt, you fish, you canoe along the way, all in an attempt to balance your well-being. The game was actually developed and funded by the Indian Land Tenure Foundation. And this game is all about the impact you have on spaces that you're in. So the story that gets told about you at the end of the game is different based on the choices you made, the hunting choices you made, the relationships you formed with people or didn't form with people, all of these types of things. So again, it's emphasizing and fostering a connection to place and being in places and the actions you take in them, and that they have consequences and not all of them are good. I also practice this in my own design. The first game I made, this game, One Small Step, is a pushback against the colonial natures that we have in open world games and that they promote. It's a space walking simulator, uses procedural generation to discover just what by immersing players in the wake of space colonization. So it's very visually deceptive in that on the surface, it presents itself as a traditional open world game, but you really quickly find out that there's nothing for you to fight. There's nothing for you to collect, and that your presence in these spaces is not free and it is not unaccounted for. Eventually, you'll change the landscape so much that the game will become inaccessible to you, and it will simply say colonization complete, and the application will close itself, and that is the end of the game because you ruined it. So that was my kind of like me being sick of the fact that we just go in these sandbox games and do whatever we want and there's no consequence. And this is full of birds, which I would like to note that I did not name. My co-creator named it. I made this with Yaktichu Tichu Chumash artist Sarah Bhaskara Dilly. And this game, the entire purpose of this is to talk about connection to place. She's an artist, and the game features her artworks, and all of the environments in the game are directly derived from the physical spaces that inspire her works of art. The sound of birds, the sound of the ocean, pieces of abalone, specific mountains, elk, certain types of flowers, all of them are there to, demonstrate our connection to Indigenous peoples to place as Indigenous peoples, and how they inspire our creation. So it's like a 3D digital art gallery. And that is all I have for you, Leonie. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You packed so much into your 40-minute share that I'm going to have to slow down my brain and I think unspool that over the course of the next few hours. You're getting lots of signs of applause here too, from me too. Mine will be sort of less digital because I'm a less digital person. As always, we have some time for questions, which is great. And as always, I would like to give any students who have one time to sort of pull one together and go first. So I'm going to pause for just a little bit. If not, I will leap right ahead with my questions. So.
I have a question about, I'm actually I'm not like a super video game player, so I may be misrepresenting things, but my understanding is that people find a lot of community in the multiplayer games. And I was wondering if, and I know that there's often with diasporas and communities that have been sort of spread across the country or across Turtle Island, that finding community in cities and things can be a big issue. And I was wondering if you see potential in games, if that's another way for people to embody community in a digital space.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think digital spaces, they can be unfortunately toxic and foster unfortunate relationships, especially in competitive games, but especially in these open world kind of games, there's a real distinct possibility for the formation of community. And Indigenous peoples definitely have that through the creation of something like Never Alone. That's a very community oriented, they made that specifically to continue to perpetuate language and culture. They also purposefully made the main character a girl and not a boy because they wanted their young girls to see strong representation of women. But I actually just recently wrote a piece about community in Red Dead Online and how the horse girl takeover of Red Dead Online, and this female identified players who started playing the game because they liked the horse dynamic, not because they're interested in being a cowboy and killing people and robbing banks. They went out of their way to make their own community in this space that is definitely not prioritizing that type of play. They've created Facebook pages around it. They organize things like trail rides where they'll literally just be we're going to ride from Strawberry to Rhodes at this time and turn on our mics and just talk to each other. That is in no way how you are, quote, meant to play Red Dead Online, which is very competition based, earning money, those types of things. So they've created communities in these spaces of play by playing wrong in some ways. But that's not meant as in a disparaging way, playing wrong in the sense that like that's not the way the developers intended them to play the game. And I think you see that also with like modding communities or speedrunning communities, things like that. Even if they're not multiplayer games, people find ways to create community through the ways that they play the games and engage with the games. So I think that is absolutely a thing that video games can offer.
Okay, having been polite, I'm going to go now. I got a whole bunch of questions actually, and some of them are a little more afield from what you talked about than others. But I was very taken with your talk about games and gaming. 3 or 4 questions just connected to that. But given what you said about games needing to be winnable, okay, I was wondering what your thoughts would be about the possibility of some sort of video game that would focus on climate change, and do it again in the sort of the most uplifting part of your presentation, I think, were the alternative you were describing at the end. Let me connect these 2 things by saying, I wonder, part 2, so this is not the same question, but a different one. How popular are those games in terms of, to the extent that you can actually assess that at this point? Do you think games like that can compete in overall popularity with the ones that you're critiquing in the course of your presentation here?
Yeah, Never Alone was incredibly successful. Won a bunch of awards, did financially very well, got really good reviews from like your standard kind of game websites like GameSpot and Giant Bomb and IGN and stuff. Like people who play games reviewed it very well, that it's also a well-made, enjoyable game. That one had the good fortune of being produced by a game development company, whereas like Thunderbird Strike and that kind of stuff, like in My Games or whatever, are like more independently designed. So, the financial backing is not always there to do something as like a grand scale as that. But the types of design that are happening in Indigenous made games, I think, are incredibly appealing because they do things differently. And not just these games, I can think of multiple other Indigenous designers like Nathan Powless Lyons, he actually works for, I think he works for Square Enix now as like a level designer because he designs differently. He's interested in different stakes. So I think, yes, they do have the potential because they're offering players something different, for sure.
Go back to part 1 of the question. A game about climate change, is that or is that sort of so unwinnable we shouldn't even imagine it?
Oh no, I think so. I think with Sim Earth specifically, looking at that game, like I don't know that I think all games have to be winnable. That game in particular just was like, you didn't even feel like there was the possibility that you could win. You know what I mean? Because of the lack of feedback loops and things like that, it just beat you over the head with how inept you were at that game. You know what I mean? Which I think is brilliant in a different way. But not all games, and I think the idea of like a win state has changed a lot as games have changed. So if you look at these story-driven narratives, some of them end in not happy, great ways. Like you think about the original Mass Effect trilogy, that game is about the apocalypse. Like the 3rd game ends with the world is ending, and like your spoiler alert, those games are old. The main character that you've played with through these 3 like 45-hour-long games dies, and there is like very much nothing you can do about that. So I do think that games that have darker endings or less optimistic endings are probable. Like that can be a win state. Sometimes people just want to complete the story. That's the win state.
I was just going to jump in and say it does sort of raise a question about maybe what the purpose of some of these games are besides just having fun or winning. And interesting to hear your comments on Sim Earth. I never liked that game.
Yeah.
And I never really understood why. And now it's good to know that other people didn't
Not
like it
alone.
either. I thought I was just bad at it, and so I gave up. But I guess I understood Sim Earth as to be like a Earth simulator or something, and it's, you know, you're learning about, I don't know, sustainability or something. I can't even remember what the purpose of the game was, but you know, as soon as you start trying to simulate something real, it gets complicated really, really fast. And I'm thinking about a climate change game, which could be a tool for getting people to think critically about how to solve the climate challenge. But that is such a complex problem. Can it be done realistically, and should we even try? Yeah, so again, like, should these games be teaching tools, or is it better to just create an imaginary world which has maybe not much bearing on real life? I mean, I don't know. And then who's the audience as well, especially with some of the games you're thinking about. So
yeah, I mean, I think games, I think Sim, as much as I kind of like crapped on Sim Earth during this presentation, I don't think that like that should be the like, don't ever make a game that's about simulation and these grand scales. You know what I mean? I think that it was unfortunately executed poorly, and also maybe a little ahead of its time in terms of what it was trying to do. And when you think about it, it came out in 1990, 30, almost 32 years ago. Video games, like home console games, had only been around for 8 years, really, kind of at that point, 8-9 years. So I think what it was asking of its players was a lot. And I think it would maybe do better now with some fixes. So that's not to say you can't make a game like that. And game studies scholars, Jane McGonigal in particular, has demonstrated that games are incredibly powerful tools for learning, that like they've done, you know, brain scan studies that all the centers of your brain that are firing when you're learning are firing when you're, that are like essential for learning, are firing when you play a game. Not just digital games, but like most games. So I think the potential and the power is there, but like you said, it's kind of, how do we scale this down into a way that has, even if it's not a win state, like while you're playing, it has to have these rewarding feedback loops. It has to make you feel like you are involved, are capable in some ways. Not always. That's not to say it can't be challenging, but it can't do the Sim Earth move of like, we don't even need you. You can literally turn this on, then the game will play itself. And when you trying to help actually makes it worse, you know? So I think there's the potential. It's just about, I think it's about scale, and it's about like, how do you on such a big scale make fulfilling feedback loops? I don't know that I have the answer to that, but I don't think it's impossible.
I was going to touch on the question of scale too, because I talk about that a lot when I teach about climate change. As one of the problems that we have with, in terms of thinking about that, is the inability of us as human beings. Some historian at some point said we can think 2 generations back and 2 ahead. We know our grandparents, we might know our grandkids, right? Anything beyond that shifts over into this more fictive realm, right? And our inability to comprehend the scale of climate change and the scope of it is part of what's in the way of our ability to actually address it.
Yeah. And again, that was kind of like one of the things about Sim Earth that people said, that like we can't possibly understand the beginning to the end of the Earth. That's just like not within our realm of capability. But I mean, I think games like, because climate change is so much more in the public eye now, it's something that we talk about so much. I do think there are like probably realistic ways that you could replicate some of the very specific effects that climate change has. Displacement of animals, loss of homes due to like extreme weather events, things like that. I don't think things like that are necessarily unattainable or unachievable. I think those are very real and specific, but they might have to be like these smaller scale games. So maybe like a series of games, or like levels in a game that are particular experiences rather than trying to do the whole thing in one swath, you know.
Let me actually make a pitch for those of you who've gotten intrigued by video games. There's somebody here, I don't know if you actually know, somebody in our Department of Atmospheric Sciences, Jürgen Frierson.
That name is very familiar.
Okay, he runs and does something on our campus called Earth Games.
Oh, okay, yeah, that's why I know that name. Yep.
Right.
Yeah.
And he's quite an amazing guy. I mean, he's a lot of fun, but a campus that offers a whole lot for students who want to go in all kinds of directions. And he does, in fact, teach a course, right, in video gaming. Okay. We asked you to come in part because, you know, you've thought a lot about land, okay, and the place and indigenous backgrounds to all of this, right? It would be great to have both of you together now that I think about it. That would be a lot of fun.
Hey.
Ashlee, I'd like to, can you hear me okay? I'd like to ask a question as well. You know, so this, in the past few months, we've been hearing a lot about the metaverse, right? And we've been talking about, we've heard more and more about virtual reality. And I'm wondering, you know, thinking about sort of even Minecraft and the example you provided, it's very simple in terms of the blocks and the shapes. Do you think that moving towards virtual reality, as some would like us to do, does that offer opportunities in not only in developing games, but in thinking about sort of how we interact with landscapes within those games? And do you think it also does it offer opportunities to Indigenous game designers, or do you think it's maybe just more flash?
I think actually I'm glad you asked this, because I actually think VR has the potential to change our relationship to landscapes in games, because it will actually be able to replicate the physical reality of being in a place in a much more real way than a 3D game does. I mean, even something like it's a South African game. It's called Rangi. It's a VR game, and it uses like music and colors and stuff to do puzzles. But what that game does, which is kind of not even the point of the game, is a lot of the environments, you're up on like a really high place and like you can see that like you could fall, and it's very disorienting. You know what I mean? In a way that, you know, when you play Assassin's Creed Odyssey and you climb to the top of a statue on the top of a mountain and then swan dive off of it because you have no fear of anything happening to you, you know, it's about scale and about like your physical relationship to the environment that you're in. And I think VR is very powerful in that way. It can create those connections in a much more realistic way. If you're in VR and like, not to like get gross or whatever, but like if you had to like kill a deer in VR and like there's like blood spray or something, like that's going to be shocking to a lot of people, things like that. Even in Red Dead 2, when you shoot an animal and if you injure it and it doesn't die, it will like cry. And I know the first time I played it, I was like, oh boy, like, because it was just this other level of kind of connection and relationship that hadn't been there before, that was deeply unsettling. And I think VR has, specifically in relation to like physical environments and landscapes, really has the potential, once we figure out the gap between I can see all this stuff in the game, but I'm standing in a like 5x5 space, like how do we do that? You know, that's the kind of stopgap right now, unfortunately, but I think the potential is there.
Thank you.
Any more student questions? I have one more. I always have one more. I have more than one more.
You guys can also I can put my email in the chat. If you have questions afterwards and think of them later, you can email me. I'm always happy to.
I have another question, but if another student doesn't. But when you were talking about Minecraft, I was thinking about Animal Crossing and like how there's like both like similar and sort of different relationships with land. Like it's still very colonial. It's like you gather everything for the museum and like also about kind of how you're talking about playing things wrong, because I've been stuck in Animal Crossing because I won't weed and cut down trees and stuff like that. And I was curious about like, I guess just like what your thoughts are on that game, on like, I feel like there are all these different ways that people have tried to like approach like that game is like grasping to have a relationship with land, but it's not, it's still a very exploitative relationship with land. And I was curious what your thoughts are about those sorts of.
Yeah, those games are interesting because they're, like you said, there's like, it's kind of there, but it's still this like, well, yeah, you have to weed and chop down trees and fish and whatever to like make money or collect stuff for the museum. You know, it is about being in the environment, and that's like kind of the large appeal, I think, of those games, is like being in the physical landscape, but it is still this very like consumption-based capitalistic mechanic at work. But I also kind of wonder if something like, there's like farm simulator games and stuff, which appeal to a very specific group of people, because I don't think the vast majority of people find them fun, because it's like very realistically like simulating farming and like what goes into farming and the like relationship with the land that's happening there. So I think like if you met somewhere in the middle between Animal Crossing and Farm Simulator, that might be like the perfect, you know? So I think there's room there, but yeah, like you said, even these games that sometimes are kind of trying, it's just not quite there. And that's the case for so many things in video games, whether it's violence or representations of other, you know, genders, sexualities, races. Like a lot of games they're so close, but not so much, you know, not quite there. You know, Red Dead Redemption is a prime example of things like that. They're trying, but they missed. Yeah, so I think there's room for that kind of stuff. It just hasn't happened quite yet.
I'm gonna have Sean